He heard two alien women fighting outside his door. All for one warm human home. Ethan sat in his small apartment. The faint hum of his computer, the only sound breaking the silence of the evening. He wasn't sure why he liked the quiet so much. Perhaps it was because the world outside always seemed to be filled with noise. The human colony he lived on, far from Earth, was supposed to be a peaceful, neutral place for various species to interact. Yet, as with any colony, it was never truly free from the occasional tension. Ethan had come to appreciate the calmness of his home. The walls, though made of metal and synthetic materials, felt like a refuge. He had everything he needed: food, shelter, and the quiet solitude he'd grown accustomed to since arriving. He wasn't a fighter or a politician, just a simple mechanic who had come to work in a place where humans were still few and far between. Life on this alien world had its ups and downs, but for the most part it was manageable. As he sat at his desk, working on a small mechanical device, his attention was drawn to the sounds outside. At first it was faint, muffled voices like the distant hum of a conversation. He didn't pay it much mind. Aliens often gathered in groups near the residential quarters, speaking in languages he didn't fully understand. They were harmless, just a bunch of different species talking about whatever mattered to them. But then the voices grew louder. There was an edge to them now, rising in anger. The words were clipped and sharp, though Ethan couldn't make them out. He sighed and set the tool down. He'd learned to ignore minor disturbances over the past year, but this wasn't the usual chatter. This was different. It was an argument. Curious, Ethan rose from his chair and approached the door. He pressed his ear to the cool metal, trying to catch any familiar phrases. But all he heard was a jumble of alien words, heated and fast. He hesitated. It wasn't his business, after all. But his curiosity won out. He opened the door a crack, just enough to peer outside without fully exposing himself. What he saw caught him completely off guard. Two alien women stood facing each other just outside his doorstep. One was tall, her posture rigid and military-like, with skin a deep shade of blue. Her eyes were intense, focused on her opponent, a fierce look that could have cut through steel. The other woman was shorter, with a soft green glow emanating from her translucent skin. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading, as she spoke rapidly in a language Ethan couldn't understand. Despite the differences in their appearance, both women were unmistakably angry. Their voices clashed, loud and forceful, as they argued over something. Ethan couldn't quite understand their words, but it was clear that they were not just having a regular dispute. This was personal. "Hey," Ethan called out cautiously, stepping into the hallway just outside his door. "Is everything okay?" The two women turned at once, as if they had forgotten he was there. The tall, blue-skinned woman's eyes narrowed, and she took a step forward, her posture brimming with tension. The green-skinned woman, on the other hand, seemed to relax slightly, her gaze softening as she regarded him. "Human," the blue-skinned woman said, her voice low and controlled but filled with a quiet menace. "Stay out of this." The green-skinned woman stepped in front of her, raising a hand to calm the other woman. "Please, don't mind her," she said, her voice gentle but with an undertone of desperation. "We are just negotiating." Ethan blinked, confused. Negotiating for what? He glanced between the two women, trying to make sense of the situation. "I don't mean to intrude, but you seem to be arguing," he said slowly. "I was just curious what's going on." The green-skinned woman glanced back at her companion, then gave a small sigh. "It's complicated," she said, turning back to him. "My name is Lyra. I'm from the Kaliner faction." Ethan raised an eyebrow. He'd heard of the Kaliners. They were a peaceful race, mostly farmers and environmentalists. "And you?" he asked, glancing at the blue-skinned woman. "I'm Kira," the blue-skinned woman answered curtly. "From the Korthar Empire." Ethan didn't know much about the Korthars, but from the looks of Kira, they were a warrior race, strong, disciplined, and feared across the galaxy. This was getting more interesting by the second. "Okay, so what's the problem?" he asked, stepping out fully into the hallway now. "Why are you two fighting outside my door?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously to Kira before looking back at Ethan. "We're negotiating for the right to stay here," she said softly, almost like she was trying to explain something obvious. "In your home," Ethan blinked. "In my home," he repeated, confusion mounting. "Wait, hold on. Are you saying you're fighting over who gets to stay with me?" Kira's eyes flashed with a dangerous glint. "Yes, we are," she said coldly. "The Kaliner and the Korthar have had some disagreements in the past." And now we are here because your planet, your colony, has become neutral ground, a place of peace, a place where our factions can meet without bloodshed. I need this house. You need my house? Ethan echoed in disbelief. Why? Lyra stepped forward, looking more embarrassed than anything. It's not just about your home, it's a symbolic gesture. Both our factions view your home as a safe haven, a place where peace can begin. The leaders of our factions want to see us settle our differences here. And we were both sent to stay here. She hesitated, her eyes lowering. The leaders promised that whichever faction takes this house will have the upper hand. Ethan felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. He had always imagined that his quiet life on this colony would be uneventful, far from any intergalactic politics. But here he was, caught in the middle of an alien dispute, both women vying for his home like it was some kind of bargaining chip. You're telling me that this house, my home, is a symbol? Ethan asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Lyra nodded slowly. Yes, both our factions believe that whoever holds this house will hold the moral high ground in the ongoing conflict. That's crazy, Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. I just wanted to live here peacefully. I didn't sign up to be the centerpiece of some political war. Kira's expression softened just a little, her posture relaxing. You didn't choose this. But now you must choose, human. If you don't decide, the conflict will escalate, and neither side will back down. Ethan stared at the two women, feeling like the weight of the galaxy was suddenly on his shoulders. They were right, of course. His home, his quiet life, had been thrust into something far bigger than he could have imagined. He had no idea how to handle something like this, no idea what decision he was supposed to make. I don't know what you want from me, he said, the words coming out in frustration. This is my home, you can't just fight over it. Lyra's expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. We don't want to fight, Ethan, she said quietly, but we have no choice. The peace we seek starts here with you. Ethan looked back at Kira, whose stern face softened just the slightest bit. He was trapped between two factions that were as different as night and day, each wanting something from him. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of this decision looming over him. What did he even know about the larger conflict between these factions? What could a single human do to influence such a vast, galaxy-spanning struggle? He didn't have the answers, but there was one thing he did know. He wasn't going to let them tear his life apart just for a political game. All right, he said slowly, his voice firming as he stepped back into his apartment. Let's talk about this, but you're both going to have to explain a lot more to me if I'm going to decide anything. Lyra and Kira exchanged a glance before following him inside. The door shut behind them, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like his life would never be the same. Ethan had hoped that his quiet life on this far-flung colony would remain uninterrupted. He had no real interest in getting involved with intergalactic politics or alien conflicts, but as the two women stepped into his apartment, that hope seemed to evaporate. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, and they stood in his small living room, each sizing up the other. Lyra, the green-skinned woman, was the first to speak. Her voice, though calm, had an undercurrent of urgency. We understand this is difficult for you, Ethan. But you must understand this isn't just about a place to sleep. This is about something much bigger. She glanced at Kira, who was standing by the window, arms crossed, her eyes focused on the stars outside. This is about the future of our factions. Ethan sat on his couch, his mind spinning. It had only been a few hours since he had discovered that his small home had become the center of a diplomatic struggle between two alien races. And now here he was, trapped in the middle of a conflict that seemed far beyond his understanding. Kira turned slowly, her blue eyes locking onto his. The Korthar Empire and the Kalinar people have been at war for decades, Ethan. This colony was meant to be a neutral zone, a place where our people could interact without violence. But the peace we've tried to maintain is fragile. The leaders of both sides believe that whoever controls this home will gain an upper hand in this delicate balance. Ethan looked from one woman to the other, trying to make sense of what they were saying. He had always been a simple man, content with his work and his solitude. He didn't have the training or the knowledge to deal with something as complex as this. You're telling me, he said slowly, that by staying here one of you is supposed to help end a war, and that's why you're fighting over my home, Lyra nodded. It sounds strange, I know. But think of it this way. This house, this place, has become a symbol of peace, a place where different races can coexist. Whoever stays here will be seen as the one who can bring the factions together. But I don't want to be a symbol, Ethan replied, his voice rising in frustration. I just want to live in peace. I didn't ask for any of this. Kira's gaze softened just a little. She uncrossed her arms and took a step closer to him. We know this is not what you expected. We are not asking you to fight our war. We are asking you to give us a chance, to let us prove that peace is possible, that it can start here. Ethan sat back, rubbing his temples as he tried to process everything. He had always seen himself as a simple man. He fixed things, he kept to himself, and he avoided conflict. But now it seemed that his entire life was about to be turned upside down. He didn't know how to fix a war. He didn't know how to play a part in something this huge. All he wanted was the quiet life he had worked so hard to create. But there was something in Lyra's eyes, a quiet sincerity that made him pause. She wasn't asking for something selfish. Neither was Kira. They both seemed to believe in their own way that they could make a difference. But it still didn't make sense to him. Why would anyone want to fight over a simple human's home? What happens if I refuse? Ethan asked, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. What if I tell you both to leave and let you fight it out elsewhere? Lyra's eyes darkened slightly. Then the peace treaty will fail. The leaders of our factions will believe that neither side can be trusted to work with the other. That will lead to an escalation of the war. And it will cost lives, more lives than you can imagine. Ethan was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He never thought he'd be the one to decide the fate of entire civilizations. He had just wanted to stay out of it, to keep his head down and live his life in peace. But now, it seemed that peace was something he would have to fight for. I don't know what to do, he said finally, looking between the two women. I don't know how I'm supposed to choose between you. Kira spoke then, her voice low but steady. You don't have to choose between us, Ethan. Not yet. We aren't here to force you into anything. We're here because we believe that if we can work together, we can change things. We can show our people that there is a way forward. That war doesn't have to be the answer. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. His mind raced as he thought about all the stories he'd heard about the Korthar Empire and the Kalanar people. The Korthars were fierce warriors known for their strength and discipline. They were respected, feared even. The Kalanars, on the other hand, were peaceful, their lives centered around nature and harmony. They were revered for their wisdom and ability to connect with the world around them. But those qualities didn't exactly make for the best allies. The two factions had been at odds for as long as Ethan had known. And now, here they were, standing in his home, asking for his help. I still don't understand, Ethan said, his voice tinged with frustration. What makes you think that by staying here you can change anything? You're both so different. How could you possibly get along? Lyra gave a small, rueful smile. We didn't start this conflict. It was forced upon us by our leaders. But you're right, we are very different. The Korthar think that strength is the only way to maintain peace. The Kalanar believe in peace through understanding and compromise, but both ways have their flaws. The truth is, we've never really tried to find a middle ground, and that's why we're here, to see if we can find a new way. Kira nodded. We're not asking for you to make that decision for us, Ethan, but we are asking you to give us a chance to try. We can't change everything overnight, but maybe, just maybe, we can start something here, with you. Ethan let out a slow breath, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He had never thought of himself as important. He was just a mechanic, a man who fixed things. But here in his small apartment, he was being asked to help shape the future of two entire races. It was too much to process all at once. Okay, he said finally, standing up and running a hand through his hair. I'll give you a chance. But I need more time to think about all of this. I need to understand what's at stake here. I need to know that you both believe in this as much as you say you do. Lyra and Kira exchanged a look. It was clear that they were both relieved, though neither of them showed it much. They had fought for this opportunity, and now it seemed they had it. But they knew that the real challenge was just beginning. We understand, Lyra said softly. Take your time, Ethan. We'll be here and we'll answer any questions you have. We owe it to you. Kira nodded as well. And we won't pressure you, but we will fight for this, for peace, and we will do it together. Ethan felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, despite the overwhelming nature of the situation. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time he felt like he had a role to play. Maybe it wasn't the life he had expected, but it was one that he could no longer ignore. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's see where this goes." As the two women settled into the small living room, Ethan took a seat by the window, staring out into the distant stars. The colony was quiet, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the peaceful calm he had known for so long, it was the quiet before the storm. And for the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than himself. The days following Ethan's reluctant decision to allow Lyra and Kira to stay in his home were filled with tension, though not in the way he had expected. Initially, he thought their presence would be a constant reminder of the political mess he'd found himself in. But over time, things began to settle into an uncomfortable rhythm. The two women were as different as night and day, and at first their interactions were strained, to say the least. Lyra, the calm and peaceful Kaliner, would often spend hours sitting in a quiet corner of the apartment, her translucent skin glowing faintly as she meditated. Ethan had watched her in silence many times, trying to understand what she was doing. Her people had a deep connection to nature, and he had seen her make small gestures, touching the leaves of a plant in the corner of his apartment, listening to the subtle vibrations in the air. She never spoke much, but Ethan had come to realize that she was not the quiet type who avoided interaction. She was simply someone who valued silence, who found peace in the smallest details of the world around her. Kira, on the other hand, was everything Lyra was not. Her presence was commanding, intense. She didn't sit still for long, always pacing or sparring with herself, her eyes sharp and calculating. She was from the Korthar Empire, a race known for their warriors, strong, disciplined, and strategic. Ethan had seen her practice her combat techniques in the apartment's small living room, her movements fluid and precise. She would sometimes train with a practice blade, performing intricate strikes in the air, her blue skin flashing with every motion. At first, it felt like there was a barrier between them, as though the two women were strangers in a foreign land. They barely spoke to each other, and when they did, it was usually through tense exchanges, each one trying to convince the other that their way of thinking was the right one. Ethan had quickly learned that the Kaliners and the Korthars were as divided as their personalities, and their differences went far beyond their actions. They were embedded deep in their cultures. But one evening, things began to change. Ethan had been sitting at his workbench, tinkering with a broken device that had been brought to him by a neighboring merchant. The quiet clatter of his tools was interrupted by Lyra's voice. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice carrying a calmness that was almost meditative. "I've been thinking." Ethan paused, setting the tool down and turning toward her. He was used to her quiet manner, but there was something different in her tone today. "What's on your mind?" "I think it's time we tried to understand each other better," Lyra continued, stepping closer. "You've seen how we've been avoiding each other, how we've let our differences keep us apart. But if we're going to make this work, we have to start somewhere." Ethan nodded, intrigued but cautious. He had seen the way Lyra and Kira interacted, and it wasn't exactly the picture of cooperation. In fact, he had often wondered how two people so seemingly incompatible could ever find common ground. But something in Lyra's voice made him want to believe that they could. "I'm not sure what you mean," Ethan said slowly. "I've been trying to keep my distance from all of this, but now it feels like you're asking me to get involved in something bigger than I understand." Lyra smiled, a soft and genuine expression. "That's because it is bigger than you. But if we work together, if we can show each other that we are more than the factions we come from, maybe we can start to change things." She paused for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "I know Kira doesn't believe in peace the way I do, but maybe we can find something in between, something that both our people can accept." Before Ethan could respond, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Kira appeared in the doorway, her tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable. "What's going on?" Kira's voice was sharp, her tone betraying a hint of suspicion. "We were talking," Lyra answered calmly. "I'm just trying to open a dialogue between us. If we don't talk, we'll never understand each other." Kira crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "I don't need to understand her," she muttered, glancing at Lyra. "I need results. I need action. I didn't come here to waste time talking about feelings." Ethan could feel the tension building between the two women. He could almost see the invisible wall between them, thick with the years of conflict and distrust that had shaped their lives. But he wasn't about to let the situation escalate. He had to step in, if only to stop them from getting caught in an endless cycle of back and forth. "I think you both need to hear each other out," Ethan said, standing up from his workbench. "If we're going to move forward, you have to stop looking at each other as enemies. You're here to help each other, right? So show some respect." Kira didn't respond immediately, her blue eyes flashing with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She clearly wasn't used to being told what to do, especially not by a human, but there was something in Ethan's tone that made her hesitate just for a moment. "I don't need peace," Kira said, her voice low but steady. "I need strength. Strength is what wins battles. Strength is what keeps my people alive." Lyra stepped forward, her expression serene. "And strength is important, but without understanding, without empathy, all the strength in the universe won't stop the war. We need both, Kira, strength and understanding." Ethan could see the battle waging behind Kira's eyes. She was a warrior, raised to believe that peace was weakness, that only by dominating her enemies could she secure her people's future. But he also saw something in her, a flicker of doubt. She wasn't entirely convinced that her way was the only way. "You're both right," Ethan said, his voice firm but calm. "There's no easy answer here, but if we're going to make a difference, we need to find a way to work together. So I suggest we stop arguing about whose way is better. Instead, let's start with the one thing we all have in common. We're here. Now, let's see if we can make something of that." Kira gave him a long, hard look, as though trying to decide if she could trust him. After a long silence, she finally nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "Fine," she said, "but this doesn't change anything. I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to win." Lyra smiled, a hint of relief crossing her face. "Then let's start with a small step," she said. "Let's talk, really talk." For the next few hours, Ethan watched as Lyra and Kira took tentative steps toward each other, their conversations awkward at first but slowly becoming more genuine. They didn't agree on everything, of course, but the tension between them began to ease ever so slightly. They spoke about their cultures, their values, their reasons for believing in the things they did. And while neither woman completely changed her mind, there was a sense that they were at least starting to understand each other. Ethan found himself listening more than speaking, content to watch as the two women began to see each other as more than just representatives of their factions. Slowly, the cracks in their defenses began to show, and for the first time, Ethan saw the humanity beneath the armor, the hopes, fears, and dreams that drove both Lyra and Kira, despite the differences in their upbringing. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted, and a certain sense of camaraderie started to take root. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When the conversation finally came to an end, Kira and Lyra stood up, both looking a little less tense than they had before. There was no sudden breakthrough, no grand declaration of peace, but Ethan could see that something had changed. They were no longer enemies locked in a battle for control of his home. They were two people, two women, willing to try something different. "You've got a long way to go," Ethan said, his voice soft but sincere. "But I'm glad you're trying." Lyra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We all have a long way to go, but I believe it's worth it." Kira didn't say anything, but her gaze softened ever so slightly. It was a small gesture, but to Ethan, it felt like a sign of progress. As the two women turned and went to their separate corners of the apartment, Ethan found himself feeling a strange sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Maybe in the end, it wouldn't be his home they were fighting over, but the chance to build something new, a chance for peace. The days passed in a quiet sort of tension, like the calm before a storm. Ethan had never expected to become the center of such a complex situation. The two women, Lyra and Kira, were still at odds in many ways, but the conversations they had shared in the past few days had opened small cracks in the barriers between them. It wasn't much, but for Ethan, it was something to hold on to. In the mornings, Lyra would meditate, sitting cross-legged by the window, her gaze focused on the distant stars. She had told him once that her people believed in the rhythm of the universe, that everything had a natural flow, from the stars above to the soil below. She didn't speak often, but when she did, there was always a quiet certainty in her words. It was as though she understood things in a way Ethan could never quite grasp. Kira, on the other hand, was more active. Every day she practiced her combat techniques, moving fluidly through the apartment's small living room. The sound of her footsteps was like the thrum of a battle drum, steady and determined. She was always in motion, whether it was training, pacing, or just preparing for something. There was an intensity about her that never seemed to fade, and yet Ethan noticed that even she had moments when she would pause, as if contemplating something deeper. Despite their differences, Ethan had come to realize that they both needed each other. Lyra's calm, centered nature had begun to influence Kira, who was less quick to dismiss the idea of peace. Kira's strength and drive had also begun to challenge Lyra's more passive approach. Slowly, the two women started finding ways to cooperate, even if it was just in small ways. One evening, after a long day, the three of them sat together in the living room, eating the simple meal that Ethan had prepared. The food was nothing special, a mix of grains, vegetables, and a small portion of protein, but it was enough. It was, after all, what they had. Lyra and Kira, once so wary of each other, were now eating together without the tension that had plagued their first few days in the apartment. "You've improved," Kira said, her voice gruff but not unkind as she set her fork down. "You're cooking." "I never thought I'd say this, but it's actually good," Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I just follow the instructions on the package, nothing special." Lyra smiled softly, looking between the two of them. "Sometimes simplicity is the best. The most powerful things in life are often the simplest." Kira rolled her eyes slightly, though there was a flicker of something like respect in her gaze. "Maybe, but simplicity doesn't win wars." "It can," Lyra replied, her tone calm and sure. "Peace is not about force, Kira. It's about understanding. You can win battles with weapons, but winning hearts is how you end wars." Kira leaned back in her chair, folding her arms over her chest. "I don't know about that. War is in my blood. I've been raised to fight to protect my people. If you don't fight, you don't survive." Ethan could see the conflict in Kira's eyes, the deep-rooted belief that peace wasn't an option. He understood where she was coming from, but he also knew that Lyra was right. He'd seen enough to know that war only bred more war. He wasn't naive enough to think that peace was simple, but he had to believe that there had to be another way. "You don't always have to fight," Ethan said softly. "There are ways to survive without violence." Kira shot him a look that was both skeptical and curious. "And you think a human knows better than a Korthar? What would you do if you had to defend your home? Would you just talk your way out of it?" Ethan sighed, his gaze drifting to the small window. The stars were still bright, though the colony outside was quiet. "I don't know. But I do know that I've seen enough destruction in my life to last me a lifetime. I'm just trying to find a better way. I want to believe there's something more than fighting." Kira didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and set her empty plate down on the table. "You don't understand," she said finally. "You don't know what it's like to fight for your people, to see your friends die because you couldn't protect them. It changes you. You start believing that the only way to protect anyone is to be stronger than everyone else." Lyra's voice was soft but firm. "And that's exactly why we need to learn from each other. Strength comes in many forms, Kira. It's not just about how hard you can hit. Sometimes the hardest strength is the ability to forgive, to understand why things happen the way they do." Kira's eyes hardened again, but Ethan could see that her stance was less rigid now. It was like the walls between her and Lyra were starting to crumble piece by piece. They weren't there yet, but for the first time, Ethan felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were on the brink of something important. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to other things: family, culture, and the lives they had left behind. Lyra shared more about her home world, about the way her people lived in harmony with nature. Kira, despite her usual guardedness, spoke about her past, about the honor and discipline that shaped her as a warrior. Ethan listened quietly, surprised by how much they both had in common despite their differences. As they talked, it became clear that the conflict between the Kaliners and the Korthars was not just about territory or power. It was about fear. Fear of the other, fear of losing everything. And while Ethan couldn't fully understand the complexities of their war, he could understand the fear. He had seen it in his own life, had felt it in the quiet moments when he wondered if he was making the right choice by staying on this colony. But now, in this small apartment, there was something that felt like hope. The walls between the two women were crumbling, and Ethan could see the cracks in the foundations of their old beliefs. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next day, Kira approached Ethan while he was working on a small repair project, her voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone hesitant. Maybe there's something to what Lyra said about understanding, about seeing things differently. Ethan glanced up, surprised by the sudden shift. You've changed your mind. Kira shrugged, her blue skin rippling slightly as she moved. I don't know if I've changed my mind completely, but I'm starting to see that maybe strength isn't just about fighting. Maybe it's about something more. Lyra entered the room just then, her usual calm demeanor steadying the air around them. She gave Kira a small smile, as if pleased by the conversation. Ethan set his tools down, wiping his hands on a rag. It's a start, he said with a small smile of his own. One step at a time. Over the following weeks, things continued to shift between the three of them. The tension was still there, but it was no longer the dominant force in the room. Instead, there was a growing sense of mutual respect, even if unspoken. Lyra and Kira began to spar together, not just with their weapons, but with ideas. They argued, they disagreed, but they listened. And that, Ethan realized, was the first true sign of progress. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Kira and Lyra were sitting outside on the balcony, watching the stars. Ethan joined them, sitting down on the edge and looking out into the distance. For a long time, none of them spoke. But there was a quiet understanding between them now, a shared acknowledgement that they were all in this together. You know, Ethan said finally, breaking the silence, I never thought my home would be the place for something like this. Lyra turned to him, her soft smile as serene as ever. Sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest changes. Kira, her arms folded across her chest, glanced up at the stars. I still don't know if we'll ever fully agree, but I think we're starting to understand each other. That counts for something. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel quite so alone. There was something in the air, something shifting, and he felt that whatever came next, they might just be able to face it together. The days had turned into weeks, and Ethan had slowly come to realize something he hadn't expected. Peace was hard work. The quiet mornings in the apartment, once filled only with the hum of his work and the occasional chatter from the market outside, now felt alive with conversation. Lyra and Kira had come a long way since that first tense meeting. They had their disagreements, certainly, but something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be ignored. They were beginning to understand each other in ways neither of them had expected. Ethan had become an unexpected mediator in their uneasy truce. He would often find himself in the middle of their debates, listening to their perspectives on everything from warfare to diplomacy, trying to find common ground where there seemed to be none. Kira was still the more fiery of the two. Her Korthar nature drove her to believe that strength was the key to survival. Lyra, on the other hand, held fast to her belief that understanding and empathy were the only true path to peace. And yet, despite their differences, they had started to listen to each other in a way that Ethan couldn't have predicted. One evening, after dinner, Lyra stood up and walked over to the window. The apartment had a small view of the colony, a quiet city of bright lights and distant stars. Ethan watched her for a moment before standing up to join her. You look thoughtful, he said, his voice gentle. Lyra smiled slightly, her eyes still on the stars. I am, she said softly. I've been thinking about what you said about the possibility of something more than just war. It's strange. I've spent my whole life believing in the power of peace, but sometimes I wonder if peace itself is enough. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean, she continued, turning to face him, maybe it's not just about ending the conflict. Maybe it's about changing the way we live altogether. If we really want peace, we have to change our way of thinking. Not just for a few years, but for generations to come. Ethan could see the weight of her words, the seriousness behind them. Lyra had always been calm, collected, almost otherworldly in her serenity. But now there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a recognition that peace might be harder to achieve than she had ever imagined. I think you're right, Ethan said quietly. Real peace doesn't just come from stopping a war. It comes from understanding how we got to the point where we needed a war in the first place. Lyra nodded, a soft sigh escaping her lips. Exactly. But how do you change something that's been ingrained in your people for so long? How do you make them believe in something new? Before Ethan could answer, Kira walked in from the hallway, her expression intense but thoughtful. You start small, she said, her voice steady. You show them what peace looks like. You lead by example. Ethan and Lyra both turned to look at her, surprised by her words. Kira had always been the one to believe that peace was an illusion, something too fragile to trust. But there was a shift in her, something he couldn't quite place. Kira's eyes softened as she met their gazes. "I'm not saying it's easy," she continued, her voice quieter now. "But maybe there's something to what you both are saying. It's not just about winning anymore. It's about finding a way to stop the cycle before it starts." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this, not from Kira. He knew she was tough, strong, and unyielding, but there was something in her voice now, a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "Are you saying you believe in this?" Lyra asked, her voice gentle, almost hesitant. Kira shrugged, looking away for a moment before meeting their eyes again. "I don't know, but I'm willing to try. I think it's worth trying. Maybe we don't have to be enemies." Lyra smiled, the expression warm but cautious. "It's a start, Kira." Ethan stood silently for a moment, feeling the weight of the conversation settling in. They weren't there yet. They weren't even close. But the fact that they were all willing to try, willing to find a way to live together despite everything, was a kind of victory in itself. The next few days were quieter than usual. The tension that had once gripped the apartment had eased, and now a kind of tentative cooperation had taken root. Lyra and Kira spent more time together, not just discussing their differences but finding ways to complement each other. Kira began to take an interest in the way Lyra lived, her peaceful rituals, her connection to nature. Lyra, in turn, started learning about Kira's training, her discipline, and the way her people had survived through sheer strength. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of frustration, moments when their old ways of thinking reared their heads. But slowly, steadily, they were beginning to understand each other. One evening, as the two women sat together in the living room, Ethan watched them from the kitchen, quietly preparing dinner. Lyra was speaking in soft tones, her words laced with the same calm wisdom that had always characterized her. Kira, for the first time, was listening intently, her arms folded across her chest but without the usual defensive posture. "I've been thinking," Lyra said, her voice gentle, "about your people. The Korthar are strong, yes, but it's more than that, isn't it? Strength is about survival, yes, but there's a part of you that wants more than that. You want to protect your people to ensure that they thrive, not just survive." Kira nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "That's true. Survival is one thing, but it's not enough. We've been surviving for so long, but I wonder if there's a way to live, not just endure." Lyra smiled, a soft expression of understanding. "It's the same for my people. We've lived in peace, yes, but there's more to it than that. Peace isn't just about not fighting, it's about building something that lasts, something worth protecting." Ethan finished preparing the meal and set the plates down on the table. As he joined them, he couldn't help but smile. It was a small moment, nothing extraordinary, but it felt like a turning point. They were talking, really talking about the future. They weren't there yet, not by a long shot, but they were building something. A foundation, a beginning. "Maybe we'll never have all the answers," Ethan said as he sat down, looking at both of them. "But at least we're trying to find them together." Kira nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on him. "Maybe, I don't know if I'll ever be fully at peace with everything, but I think I'm starting to understand what you mean, about not just surviving, but living." Lyra smiled, the soft light from the window catching her features. "That's all we can do, try. And maybe along the way, we'll find a better way of living, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us." The meal was quiet, the conversation sparse but meaningful. As they ate, the weight of the future hung heavy in the air. It was impossible to know what would come next. There were still many challenges ahead, many obstacles to overcome. But for the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't just a bystander. He was part of something bigger, something that might change everything. Later that night, as they sat together in the living room, a sudden sound from outside broke the silence. It was distant at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, a low rumble that echoed through the walls. "What is that?" Kira asked, her tone immediately alert. Ethan stood up, walking over to the window. Outside, the colony's lights flickered, and he could see figures moving in the distance. It wasn't normal. It was too fast, too organized. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice steady but with a hint of concern. "But we'd better find out." Lyra and Kira were both at his side now, looking out at the horizon. The colony was quiet, but the air felt thick with tension. The stars above, once so peaceful, seemed distant, almost out of reach. Ethan turned to the two women. "We've come this far. Whatever happens, we face it together." Lyra nodded, and even Kira, for the first time, looked ready to stand beside them. "Together," Kira said, her voice strong, unwavering. Let's see this through.